Good day, everyone. Today I will be talking about education and the limits of state authority by John Stuart Mill. So, my goal today is to help you understand Mill's ideas and see why they are still relevant in guiding education and moral responsibility in society. Good day, everyone. In his first paragraph, he emphasizes these texts. So, on his statement of John Stuart Mill, he said that I have already observed that owing to the absence of any recognized general principles, liberty is often granted where it should be withheld, as well as withheld where it should be granted. A person should be free to do as he likes in his own concerns, but he ought not to be free to do as he likes in acting for another. The state is bound to maintain a vigilant control. This obligation is almost entirely disregarded in the case of family relations. It is in the case of children that misapplied notions of liberty are a real obstacle. Mill argues that because there are no clear principles about liberty, people wrongly defend freedom in situations where it harms others, especially in family life. He distinguishes between personal liberty and power over others, insisting that while individuals should be free in their own concerns, the state must control the exercise of power over dependents. In the case of children, society resists state interference, treating them as if they were literally part of the parent, which shows that people value more than liberty. The central point is that liberty must be limited when it concerns authority over others, particularly children. In this passage, Mill talks about liberty or freedom and how people often misunderstand it. Mill begins by saying that there are no clear general principle about liberty. Because of this, people sometimes give freedom where it should not be given, and they take away freedom where it should be protected. In simple words, people where it in simple words, people do not always know when freedom is right and when it is wrong. The confusion causes problems in society. Mill then makes an important distinction. He says that a person should be free to do as he likes in his own concerns. This means that if your actions only affect yourself, you should have the freedom to decide. For example, choosing your religion, your career, or your lifestyle, these are personal decisions. The government should not interfere in these matters. However, Neil adds something very important. A person should not be free to do whatever he likes when acting for another person. This means that when your actions affect someone else, especially someone who depends on you, your freedom must have limits. Freedom cannot be used as an excuse to control or harm others. Neil then talks about the role of the states. He says the state is responsible for maintaining careful control when people exercise power over others. The government has the duty to protect individuals who might be harmed by someone else's authority. But Neil points out that this responsibility is often ignored in family relationships. Society usually believes that parents should have complete authority over their children without government interference. People treat children as if they are part of their parents instead of separate individuals. Neil believes this is a mistake. He says that in the case of children, wrong ideas about liberty become a serious problem. People defend parental freedom, but they forgot that their rights and welfare. This shows that people sometimes value power more than true liberty. For example, if a parent refuses to educate a child, some might say that it is a parent's freedom. But Neil would argue that this is not just about freedom, it's about power another human being. Since the child is, affected, the state has the right to step in and protect the child's future. So the central message of this passage is clear. Liberty must be limited when it involves authority over others, especially children. Freedom is important, but it should never allow harm or neglect. In conclusion, Neil teaches us that personal freedom should be respected, but power over others must be controlled. The state has the duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves, especially children. And now let's go to second paragraph. In this paragraph, he says that consider, for example, the case of education. It is not almost a self-evident action that the state should require and compel the education of every human being who is born its citizen. Hardly anyone will deny that it is one of the most sacred duties of the parents to give an education. But while this is unanimously declared, scarcely anybody will bear to hear of obliging him to perform it. It still remains unrecognized that to bring a child into existence without instruction and training is a moral crime. Neil presents education as the clearest example of this misplaced liberty. Although people admit that parents have a sacred duty to educate their children, they oppose forcing them to fulfill it. He argues that bringing a child to the world without ensuring instruction and training is morally wrong, and therefore, if parents fail, the state ought to see the obligation fulfilled. The main idea is that compulsory education is justified because parental duty alone is not enough. In this passage, John Stuart Mill talks about education as the clearest example of misplaced liberty. He focuses on the responsibility of the parents and the role of the state in making children are educated. Mill begins by saying an important question. Is it not almost self-evident that the state should require and compel the education of every human being as citizen? In simple words, he is saying that it should be obvious that the government must make sure every child receives education. Education is not just a private matter, it affects the child and the whole society. Neil then says that almost everyone agrees that parents have a sacred duty to educate their children. Society strongly believes that parents are morally responsible for giving their children instruction and training. People say that it is one of the most important duties of a mother or even a father. However, Mill points out something interesting. Even though people say this duty is sacred, they do not want the government to force parents to fulfill it. They believe it is wrong for the state to interfere. So there is a contradiction. People agree that education is a duty, but they do not agree that parents should be compelled to do it. Neil strongly criticizes this idea. He argues that bringing a child into existence without ensuring proper instruction and training is a moral crime. That is a very strong statement, moral crime. What he means is that if parents choose to have children, they also choose the responsibility to prepare them for life. If they fail to do this, they are harming the child. For me, education is not optional. It is necessary for a person to develop properly and become a responsible member of society. Without education, a child may grow up without knowledge, skills, or moral understanding. This does not only affect the individual child, but also affects the community and the nation. Because of this, Mill believes that parental duty alone is not enough. Some parents may neglect their responsibility, some may not have the resources, others may simply refuse. If the state does nothing, children will suffer. Therefore, the state has the right and duty to step in. This is why Neil supports compulsory education. Compulsory education means that the government requires all children to receive schooling. It does not mean the government controls everything about a child's life. It simply it simply ensures that no child is left without instruction. The main idea of this passage is clear. Education is too important to depend only on parental choice. While parents have the primary duty, the state must make sure that duty is fulfilled. If parents fail, the government should ensure that the child still receives education. In conclusion, Mill argues that compulsory education is justified. Freedom should not mean allowing parents to neglect their children's future. True liberty protects individuals, especially children who cannot protect themselves. In this paragraph, he says that where the duty of enforcing universal education once admitted, if the government would make up its mind to require for every child a good education, it might save itself the trouble of providing one. It might leave the parents to obtain the education where and how they please. That the whole or any large part of the education of the people should be in the state hands. I go as far as anyone in deprecating a general state education is mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. Mill clarifies that enforcing education does not mean the state must control it. Parents may choose schools freely and the state may assist financially, but he strongly opposes a system where the government controls all education. Such control would mold citizens to fit the ideas of ruling power and create a form of despotism over the mind. The core argument is that education may be compulsory, but diversity and individuality must be protected. So Neil clarifies that an important rule or point about education and the role of the state. He argued that education should be compulsory, but now he explains that compulsory education does not mean total government control of education. Mill says that if the duty of enforcing universal education is accepted, the government does not need to provide all the education itself. In simple words, the state can require every child to receive a good education, but it does not have to run all the schools. He explains that parents can still choose where and how their children will be educated. They may send them to private schools, religious schools, or other institutions. The important thing is that the child receives proper instruction. The government's role is to make sure education happens, not to control every detail of it. Mill strongly warns against putting the whole or large part of education in the hands of the states. He says he strongly opposes this idea. Why? Because if the government controls all education, it can control how people think. He says that a general education is a contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. This means that when the government controls education, it may shape students to have the same opinions, beliefs, and values instead of encouraging independent thinking. It may produce uniform thinking. Mill is concerned about despotism over the mind. What does despotism mean? Despotism means tyranny or oppressive control. He is saying that if the state controls education completely, it can dominate people's thoughts. This is dangerous because education shapes ideas, characters, and also beliefs. For example, if a ruling government has a certain political or religious views, It might design the education system to support those views only. Students may grow up without learning how to question or think critically. Over time, society may lose diversity of thought. Neil values individuality. He believes that freedom includes freedom of thought and opinion. If everyone is educated in exactly the same way, according to one central authority, individuality may disappear. So the core idea of this passage is balance. Education may be compulsory, meaning every child must be educated, but diversity and individuality must be protected. Parents should have the freedom to choose schools. Different institutions should exist. The government should ensure standards but not control minds. In conclusion, Mill supports compulsory education to protect children and society. However, he strongly opposes total state control of education because it threatens freedom of thought. Education must be required, but it must not destroy individuality. In this paragraph, he said that unless, indeed, one society in general is in so backward a state that it could not or would not provide for itself any proper institutions of education, unless the government undertook the task. But in general, the same persons would be able and willing to give an equally education on the voluntary principle. Mill admits to one exemption: if society is too undeveloped to provide education, the government may temporarily manage school as the lesser evil. However, in most cases, capable individuals can provide education voluntarily, especially when attendance is made compulsory and supported by state aid. The central point is that state management of education is justified only in extreme circumstances. In this paragraph, John Stuart Mill gives one important exemption to his earlier argument about education and government control. Mill says that there may be a situation where society is so backward or undeveloped that people cannot or will not provide proper schools on their own. In that case, the government may need to step in and manage education directly. He considers this a lesser evil. This means it is not the best situation, but it may necessary to prevent something worse, which is ignorance. For example, if a country has very few educated people, no private schools, and no resources to build institutions, then the government may have no choice but to organize and run schools. Without government action, children might receive no education at all. However, Mill believes this situation is rare. In most cases, there are capable and willing individuals who can provide good education voluntarily. Once education is made compulsory and the state supports families financially, if needed, private individuals and groups can successfully manage schools. Neil also points main point is that state management of education should only happen in extreme circumstances. It should not be the normal system. The government's role is to ensure that education exists and that all children attend, but not necessarily to control and operate all schools. In conclusion, Mill allows government control only when society cannot provide education by itself. But in general, education should be provided voluntarily by capable individuals, with the state simply making sure that every child receives a proper education. So now, in this paragraph, John Stuart Mill says that the instrument for enforcing the law could be no other than public examinations. An age might be fixed at which every child must be examined. Beyond the minimum, there should be voluntary examinations to prevent state from exercising improper influence over opinion. All attempts by the state to bias the conclusion of its citizens on disputed subjects are evil. Neil proposes public examinations to enforce compulsory education. Children must meet a minimum standard, but higher knowledge should remain voluntary. He insists that exams should focus on facts and positive science, not on controlling beliefs about religion or politics. The state may certify knowledge, but must not shape opinions. The key idea is that enforcement should ensure incompetence without threatening intellectual freedom. In this passage, he explains how compulsory education should be enforced without giving the state too much control over people's mind. Mill says that the instrument for enforcing the law could be no other than the public examinations. This means that instead of government running all schools, it can require children to pass certain exams. These public examinations make sure that children reach a minimum level of knowledge. He suggests that a specific age should be fixed when every child must be examined. In simple words, that when children reach a certain age, they must take an exam to show that they have learned basic knowledge and skills. If they fail, there should be consequences, such as requiring future studies. Neil explains that there should be minimum standard of education that every child must meet. This ensures that no one grows up completely uneducated. However, beyond that minimum level, higher education should be voluntary. This means students can choose to continue learning more advanced subjects, but they are not forced. The important part of Mill's argument is about protecting intellectual freedom. He warns that the state must not use education a way to control opinions. He says that all attempts by the state to bias the conclusion of its citizens on disputed subjects are evil. This is very strong statement. What does this mean? It means the government should not use exams or schools to influence what people believe about religion, politics, or other controversial issues. The state should not decide what citizens must think. It should only make sure they are educated enough to think for themselves. For example, exam contest reading, writing, mathematics, and scientific facts. These are objective subjects, but the government should not require students to accept a specific political belief or religious doctrine as part of passing the exam. Mill believes the state may certify knowledge, but it must not shape opinions. The government can confirm that a person knows certain facts or skills, but it should not force them to hold certain personal beliefs. The key idea in this passage is so balanced. The state has the right to enforce education to ensure competence. Every citizen should have basic knowledge and skills, but this enforcement must not threaten intellectual freedom. People must remain free to form their own opinions. In conclusion, Mill proposes public examinations as a fair way to ensure compulsory education. They protect society from ignorance while also protecting individuals from mental control. Education should create informed citizens, not controlled minds. So now, in this paragraph, in his last paragraph, he says that it is not in the matter of education only that misplaced notions of liberty prevent moral obligations. The fact itself of causing the existence of a human being is one of the most responsible actions. To undertake this responsibility on less ordinary chances of a desirable existence is a crime. The laws forbid marriage unless the parties can show that they have the means of supporting a family, do not exceed the legitimate powers of the states. When we compare the strange respect of mankind for liberty with a strange wants to respect for it, Mill extends this argument beyond education to parenthood itself. Bringing a child into existence without the means of support and educate him is morally wrong and may justify legal restriction. Laws preventing irresponsible marriage are not violations of liberty because they prevent harm to others. He concludes by criticizing society and consistency. People defend harmful freedom yet fail to respect true liberty. The main idea is that liberty must never include the right to harm others. In this passage, John Stuart Mill expands his argument beyond education and talks about parenthood itself. He explained that misplaced ideas about liberty do not affect education but also the decisions to bring a child into the world. Mill says that causing the existence of a human being is one of the most responsible actions a person can take. In simple words, having a child is not a small decision. It carries a very serious responsibility. When parents decide to have a child, they are also deciding to take care of the child's life, development, and future. Mill strongly argues that to undertake this responsibility without giving the child ordinary chances of a desirable existence is a crime. This is a very strong statement. It is a moral crime. What he means is that if parents bring a child into the world without ability to support, feed, educate, and care for that child, they are doing something morally wrong. For me, liberty does not mean you can do anything you want without thinking about the consequences. If your actions will harm another person, especially someone helpless like a child, then the action should not be protected by the liberty. He even says that laws which forbid marriage unless the couple can show they have the means to support a family do not exceed the legitimate power of the state. This means that if the government requires couples to prove they can financially support a child before marrying, this is not a violation of freedom. Why? Because the purpose of the law is to prevent harm to future children. Mill believes that the state has the right to prevent actions that will clearly cause harm to others. A child who is born into extreme neglect or without basic support suffers because of these parents' irresponsible decision. Therefore, preventing that harm is not an attack on liberty. It is a protection of our children. At the end, Mill criticizes society's inconsistency. He says people show strange respect for liberty in the strong situations, but at the same time, they show a strange lack of respect for true liberty. In other words, people defend harmful freedoms like freedom to neglect a child, but they fail to defend the real freedom of individuals who are being harmed. The main idea of this passage is very clear. Liberty must never include the right to harm others. Freedom is important, but it has limits. It has limitations. When someone's action directly affect another person's well-being, especially a child, the state has the right to intervene. So to sum up in everything, Mill reminds us that true liberty is not simply the freedom to do whatever we want. It is the responsibility to act in ways that do not harm others. particularly those who are vulnerable. As citizens and a society, we must balance individual freedom and moral responsibility, ensuring that liberty protects rather than endangers human life and well-being. Thank you for listening to my presentation on education and the limits of state authority by John Stuart Mill. I hope this discussion has given you a clearer understanding of how liberty, responsibility, and the role of the state interact, especially in education and parenthood. Let us remember that true freedom is not just doing what we want, but also ensuring that our actions do not harm others. Thank you again for your time and attention and for staying with me until the end. Bye.